Hello everyone, welcome. Help me grow my channel by subscribing. Tell me which place are you talking about. And now let's get started. My name is Brian Mitchell, and what I'm about to share isn't some extraordinary tale of elaborate schemes or criminal masterminds. It's scarier than that because it could happen to anyone. I received this email from Sarah Turner, a 25-year-old barista from Seattle, and her story haunts me because of how ordinary it all started. I never thought I'd be writing an email like this, Sarah began. I'm just a regular person. I work at the Daily Grind Cafe downtown, share an apartment with my best friend Emma, and like taking pictures of my coffee art and sunset walks. Nothing special, you know. But after what happened, I need to warn others about how the most normal-seeming interactions can turn into something terrifying. Sarah's Instagram account was like millions of others. Pictures of latte art she created at work, her cat Mr. Whiskers, weekend hikes with friends, and the occasional selfie. She had around 600 followers. Mostly regulars from the cafe, friends, and other baristas sharing their coffee creations. The comment appeared on one of her latte art photos 3 months ago. The way you created that gradient in the foam is incredible. Been trying to learn this technique myself. The account, coffee.connoisseur92, had a feed full of cafe reviews and coffee photos. Tom, as his bio named him, seemed like just another coffee enthusiast. Their interactions started with likes and comments about coffee techniques. Sarah would post her latest latte art creation, and Tom would ask questions about temperature, timing, and technique. It felt like the kind of genuine interaction that social media was made for, people sharing common interests. Looking back at those early comments now, Sarah says she can't believe how blind she was to the warning signs. But why would she have questioned it? Social media is built on these casual connections, these seemingly innocent interactions between people with shared interests. The direct messages started after Sarah posted about struggling with a particular foam design. Tom offered some helpful tips, mentioning that he'd learned them while working at a cafe in Portland. The conversation flowed naturally from coffee to work experiences to general life in the Pacific Northwest. He felt safe, Sarah wrote in her email. He never flirted or said anything inappropriate. We just talked about coffee, work frustrations, and sometimes shared funny memes about customer service. His profile showed he was around my age, and everything he said about working as a barista rang true. Their conversations remained casual but regular. Tom would comment on her stories about difficult customers, sharing his own similar experiences. He seemed to understand exactly the daily challenges of working in the service industry. When Sarah posted about a particularly rough day at work, he sent a funny barista meme that made her laugh. Sarah noticed that Tom became one of her most consistent followers, always among the first to like her posts or respond to her stories. At the time, it just seemed like he was active on Instagram and interested in engaging with fellow coffee enthusiasts. Nothing about it felt strange or forced. What she didn't realize then was how carefully he was reading every caption, every comment, every response she made to other followers. He was building a detailed picture of her life, piece by tiny piece, through the digital breadcrumbs we all leave behind on social media. The friendly banter felt like the kind of connection many of us have made online. Someone who shares our interests and seems to get our daily struggles. Nothing more, nothing less. The first moment that gave Sarah pause came when Tom mentioned a new bagel place she should try. The same one she'd walked past that morning but hadn't posted about. When she asked how he knew about it, he said he'd seen it in the background of one of her recent stories. She checked her posts, but couldn't find any that showed the bagel shop. A week later, he commented on her new haircut minutes after she left the salon, before she'd posted any photos. She hadn't even mentioned getting a haircut on Instagram. When she pointed this out, he quickly replied that her regular hairdresser had posted a photo of her. Sarah didn't have a regular hairdresser. It was her first time at that salon. These incidents nagged at her, but each one was small enough to dismiss. Maybe she had posted about the bagel shop and forgotten. Maybe someone else had mentioned her haircut online. We're all so used to sharing our lives on social media that it's easy to lose track of what we've actually posted. Then Tom started mentioning specific customers she'd served. The woman with the unusual tea order. The businessman who always asked for extra shots. These were details Sarah hadn't shared online. When questioned, he would always have a plausible explanation, but the coincidences were adding up. Sarah began paying more attention to her surroundings at work. The cafe was always busy with people, on laptops or phones. Anyone could be watching without seeming out of place. She started noticing a guy who came in regularly during her shifts, always sitting in the corner with his laptop. Had he always been there, or was she just becoming paranoid? The The growing unease made her start reviewing her Instagram profile with new eyes. How much information had she inadvertently shared? Her work schedule could be pieced together from her posts. The route she walked home was obvious from her sunset photos. Her apartment building appeared in the background of several shots. Sarah's roommate Emma noticed her becoming increasingly anxious about her social media presence. "You need to look at his profile more carefully," Emma suggested one evening. Together they began really analyzing Coffee.Connoisseur92's account. What they found was disturbing in its subtlety. All of Tom's photos were generic coffee shots that could have been taken anywhere. His personal photos were always at odd angles or slightly blurry. The cafe he claimed to work at in Portland existed, but when Sarah called them, they'd never heard of him. His comments on other profiles followed a pattern. Always coffee-related, always technically knowledgeable, but never revealing any personal details. It was as if someone had studied coffee culture and created a perfectly crafted persona to seem legitimate within that community. The most unsettling discovery came when Emma found one of Tom's photos on a coffee blog from 2019. The exact same image, but posted years earlier by someone else. They began reverse image searching his other photos. Each one was taken from various coffee blogs and Instagram accounts. Looking through their DM history with this new perspective, Sarah realized how Tom had carefully extracted information from her, while sharing nothing verifiable about himself. Every personal story he'd shared was vague enough to be untraceable, but specific enough to seem real. It was like he'd created the perfect filter, Sarah wrote in her email, not for photos, but for himself. Everything he showed was carefully designed to appear normal and relatable while revealing nothing. The moment everything changed came on a rainy Tuesday evening. Sarah was closing the cafe alone, something she'd mentioned in passing during a DM conversation with Tom. As she was locking up, she noticed the regular from the corner table standing across the street, just watching. When their eyes met, he quickly looked down at his phone. Seconds later, a message from Tom popped up on her Instagram. "That rain looks heavy. Be careful walking home." Sarah felt her blood run cold. She hadn't posted anything about the rain. She called Emma, who stayed on the phone with her while she took a different route home. The man from the cafe didn't follow her, but that night she went through every conversation she'd ever had with Tom, taking screenshots and noting down all the times he'd known things he shouldn't have. The next day, she noticed the same man at the cafe again. This time, she asked her coworker about him. "Oh yeah, he started coming in regularly about 3 months ago," her coworker said. "Always during your shifts. I figured he had a crush on you or something. 3 months ago. Exactly when a coffee." Connoisseur92 had first commented on her posts. Sarah felt sick as she realized how long she'd been watched. How many details about her life she'd freely shared with someone who'd been sitting just feet away, pretending to be a stranger. That evening, she received a DM from Tom that made her heart stop. "That green sweater looks nice on you today. Brings out your eyes." She was wearing a green sweater, at home with all her curtains closed. Sarah went to the police with her documentation, the screenshots, the pattern of behavior, the suspicious timing. While they took her report seriously, they explained how difficult it would be to prove anything criminal had occurred. The photos were taken in public places, the messages weren't explicitly threatening, and they couldn't prove who was actually behind the account. She didn't wait for things to escalate further. She stayed with her parents for a week, while Emma helped her move to a new apartment. She changed her work schedule, varied her routes, and made her social media accounts private. The cafe installed new security cameras and implemented a policy about customer photos. The man in the corner never returned to the cafe after Sarah filed the police report. The Coffee.Connoisseur92 account disappeared a day later. But Sarah knew that didn't mean she was safe. He had all the information he'd collected over those months, and he could easily create a new account, craft a new persona. "What terrifies me most," Sarah wrote, "isn't that this person turned out to be dangerous. It's that I'll never know how many other online interactions might be someone like him. Every friendly comment, every shared interest, every seemingly genuine connection could be another carefully crafted lie." I've investigated many cyberstalking cases in my career, but Sarah's story stands out because of its simplicity. There were no elaborate schemes, no dramatic confrontations, just the slow revelation that someone had turned normal social media interactions into a tool for stalking. Her story is important because it could happen to anyone. We all share pieces of our lives online, thinking we're connecting with people who share our interests. Sometimes we are, but sometimes, behind that perfect Instagram filter, there's someone watching, waiting, and collecting every detail we carelessly share with the world. Editor's note: Names and identifying details have been changed to protect privacy. This story is part of our ongoing series on social media safety awareness. My name is Brian Mitchell, and this story still keeps me awake at night. The email arrived during a thunderstorm, the kind that makes Seattle feel even darker than usual. Emma Chen's account of what happened to her isn't a story of elaborate schemes or complex plots. It's a story of loneliness, pain, and how our desperate need for connection can lead us into darkness. I should have known better, Emma's email began. As a night shift nurse, I understand how vulnerability works. I see it every day in my patients' eyes, that desperate need for human connection when you're alone and scared. I just never thought I'd become a victim of my own loneliness. The night shifts at Seattle General had taken their toll on Emma. While the rest of the world slept, she worked in the fluorescent-lit corridors, caring for patients who were often experiencing the worst moments of their lives. Her Instagram became her connection to the normal world, a place to share snippets of her life between the exhausting 12-hour shifts. Her posts were simple: coffee cups from the hospital cafeteria, the Seattle skyline at dawn when her shift ended, occasional selfies in her scrubs, and photos of her small apartment garden. Nothing extraordinary, just the kind of content that helps people feel less alone in their daily struggles. The first message from Seattle photographer Mike came on a particularly difficult night. She had just lost a young patient and posted a subtle story about having a hard shift. No details, just a photo of her coffee cup with the caption, "Some nights are harder than others." His response seemed genuinely caring. "Thank you for doing what you do. Healthcare workers are the real heroes." What followed was 3 weeks of increasingly personal conversations. Mike understood the loneliness of irregular hours. He claimed to be a freelance photographer who often worked nights capturing Seattle's cityscape. His profile showed beautiful night photography of familiar streets and buildings. He seemed real, seemed safe. Their conversations developed a rhythm. Emma would post about her shift, and Mike would respond with understanding and encouragement. He shared stories about his own late-night adventures photographing the city, the quiet moments before dawn when Seattle belonged to the insomniacs and night workers. The decision to meet came after a particularly emotional exchange. Emma had posted about a successful patient recovery, and Mike suggested celebrating with coffee at Dawn's Edge, a cafe near the hospital that opened early for the night shift workers. It seemed perfect, a public place, early morning when other healthcare workers would be around. Emma took precautions. She shared Mike's profile and the meeting details with her best friend Lisa, who worked day shift at the same hospital. They arranged for Lisa to call shortly after the meeting started, and Emma would use their code word if she felt uncomfortable. Everything was planned, sensible, safe. The morning of the meet arrived. Emma had just finished her shift, still in her scrubs with her navy blue jacket over them. Dawn's Edge was starting to fill with the usual mix of nurses, doctors, and early morning office workers. She chose a table near the counter, in clear view of the baristas. Mike arrived exactly on time. He looked like his profile pictures, mid-30s, average height, brown hair, wearing a camera bag across his shoulder. Nothing about him raised immediate alarm bells. He ordered their coffees, making casual conversation about the morning light and how it would be perfect for photography. It was only when they sat down that Emma noticed something off about his camera bag. The brand was worn away in places it shouldn't be if he used it regularly. When she mentioned it, his explanation came too quickly, too rehearsed. The first crack in his perfect facade. The conversation flowed, but each moment brought new discomfort. Mike knew details about the hospital layout she hadn't shared. He mentioned specific spots where she took her breaks, describing the view from the third-floor staff room where she often ate lunch. She had never posted about these locations. When Lisa's call came, Emma felt relieved to have an excuse to step away. In the bathroom, she texted her friend the code word. Something felt wrong. Mike's knowledge was too specific, his questions too probing about her schedule, her routes home, her living situation. Returning to the table, Emma made an excuse about being called into work early. Mike's expression changed for just a moment, a flash of anger that disappeared so quickly she almost doubted seeing it. He insisted on walking her out, despite her protests that she was meeting a colleague. In the days that followed, Mike's online presence became overwhelming. He commented on every post within minutes. His messages became more frequent, asking about her schedule, questioning why she took different routes to work. How did he know she had changed her route? The hospital's security office called her in, 3 days after the coffee meeting. Someone had been accessing the staff parking lot at night, leaving small gifts on her car. coffee cups from Dawn's Edge, each with increasingly desperate messages written on them. The security footage was too dark to identify the person. Emma's world began to shrink. She changed her shifts, varied her schedule, made her social media private. But Mike had already collected enough information. He knew her patterns, her preferences, her vulnerabilities. The evidence of his watching was everywhere. Photos of her car in different locations, comments about conversations she'd had in public places. The police were sympathetic, but limited in what they could do. The messages weren't explicitly threatening. The gifts could be explained away as admiration. The photos were taken in public places. They advised her to document everything, change her routines, be aware of her surroundings. The psychological toll was devastating. Every shadow in the parking lot became a threat. Every ping from her phone sent her heart racing. The job she loved became tainted by fear. Even her patients noticed the change. The once confident nurse now jumped at sudden movements, constantly checked over her shoulder. The Instagram photos on Mike's profile began to change. The beautiful cityscapes were replaced with photos of empty hospital corridors, parking lots at dawn, the street where she lived, all taken from a distance, all technically legal, all carrying an implicit threat. He was always watching, always waiting. One night, exhausted from the constant vigilance, Emma fell asleep without checking her windows. She woke to find her apartment had been entered. Nothing was taken, but things were moved slightly. A coffee cup placed on her nightstand, her scrubs laid out on the bed, her phone's camera roll open to photos she'd never taken of herself sleeping. The violation was complete. The space that had been her sanctuary became another source of terror. Even after changing apartments, installing security systems, and taking every precaution, the feeling of being watched never left. The simple act of being alone in her own home became an exercise in constant fear. The stalking escalated in subtle, but terrifying ways. Mike created multiple accounts to continue watching her after she blocked him. He sent messages from different numbers, each showing he knew her new address, her new routines, her attempts to escape. Her life became a prison of hypervigilance. Work became her only refuge, but even that was tainted. Patients' families would mention receiving messages about her, warnings that she was unfit to provide care. Anonymous complaints were filed against her at the hospital. Her professional reputation, built over years of dedicated service, was under attack. The psychological warfare took its toll. Emma lost weight, couldn't sleep, jumped at every sound. The strong, compassionate nurse who had helped so many through their darkest hours now struggled to help herself. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had become as vulnerable as the patients she cared for. Other nurses began receiving messages too. Detailed information about Emma's mental state. Suggestions that she was unstable, dangerous even. The solidarity of her colleagues crumbled under the constant drip of poisonous lies. Some began to distance themselves, believing the rumors despite years of working together. The breaking point came when Lisa, her closest friend and supporter, received a video. It showed Emma in her new apartment, unaware she was being filmed through her window. The message accompanying it suggested that Emma had staged everything for attention, that she was mentally ill, that she couldn't be trusted. Even knowing it was all lies. The seed of doubt had been planted in her support system. The isolation Mike had orchestrated was complete. Emma's world had been systematically dismantled, relationship by relationship, certainty by certainty, until she questioned her own sanity. The resolution, when it came, wasn't dramatic. Mike wasn't caught in a spectacular sting operation or brought down by brilliant detective work. Instead, he made a simple mistake. He used a hospital computer to send one of his messages, triggering an IT security alert. He was a hospital orderly on a different shift, someone who had watched Emma for months before orchestrating their chance online encounter. The evidence they found on his devices revealed the full scope of his obsession. Thousands of photos, detailed notes about her schedule, recordings of her phone calls made through cloned apps, elaborate plans to isolate her from her support system. He had studied her for months, learning her vulnerabilities, before ever making contact. The legal system worked as designed. Restraining orders were issued, charges were filed, a plea deal was struck. But the damage was done. Emma's sense of safety, her trust in human connection, her belief in her own judgment had been shattered. The psychological wounds would take far longer to heal than the legal process took to conclude. The hardest part, Emma wrote in her email, isn't the fear or the violation. It's the loss of who I was. I used to be someone who believed in the good in people, who trusted her instincts, who felt safe in her own skin. Now I'm someone who checks her rearview mirror 20 times on the way to work, who can't sleep without lights on, who flinches when a patient reaches for her hand. I've covered many stories of online stalking, but Emma's account haunts me because of its ordinariness. There were no dramatic confrontations, no violence, just the methodical destruction of one person's sense of safety and self. The real horror wasn't in what he did, but in how thoroughly he unmade her world using nothing more than information she had willingly shared and trust she had freely given. As I write this, Emma is slowly rebuilding her life. She still works as a nurse, still cares for patients through their darkest hours, but now she understands darkness differently. She knows how it can seep into every corner of a life, how it can make a home in the spaces between heartbeats, how it can wear a friendly face and speak with a caring voice. Her story isn't one of triumph over evil, but of survival in the face of ordinary human cruelty. And sometimes, that's the most terrifying story of all. Editor's note: names and identifying details have been changed to protect privacy. This story is part of our ongoing series on digital stalking awareness and victim support resources. My name is Brian Mitchell, and I never thought a violin's melody could sound like a scream. This story came to me through an email from Rachel Martinez, a young music teacher whose love for teaching became her worst nightmare. Her words still echo in my mind, like a song that turns discordant the longer you listen. Music was my everything, Rachel's email began. The way kids' eyes light up when they first make a sound on an instrument, the peace in playing violin at sunset, the joy of sharing what I love. I never imagined someone could take that away from me, note by note, until every melody became a warning sign. Rachel taught at Westbrook Elementary while performing at local events on weekends. Her Instagram, Rachel's Violin, showcased both aspects of her life: short clips of student performances, her own practice sessions, and weekend gigs at coffee shops and small venues. It was her way of connecting with other musicians and finding performance opportunities. The first comment from Classical Music Lover appeared on a video of her playing Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto. Your technique is flawless, but there's such sadness in your interpretation of the third movement. It's like you understand the composer's pain. Looking back, Rachel realizes how that comment foreshadowed everything. He could already see vulnerability where others saw only beauty. David, as he called himself, seemed knowledgeable about classical music. His profile showed concert halls, violin close-ups, and music scores. Nothing personal, just the kind of content a classical music enthusiast might share. He engaged thoughtfully on her posts, discussing technique, interpretation, and music theory. Their early interactions revolved around music, with David offering insights about pieces she was teaching her students. He claimed to be a music professor at a small college in Oregon, and his knowledge seemed to support that. Rachel felt a connection with someone who understood both the technical and emotional aspects of her art. The conversations deepened over several weeks. David shared stories about teaching music, recommended pieces for her students, and commented on her weekend performances with detailed musical analysis. He became a regular presence on her profile, always supportive, always insightful. Rachel noticed his comments becoming more personal, referencing specific emotions he perceived in her playing. "There's a loneliness in your vibrato today," he would write. Or, "The way you rush the tempo slightly speaks of hidden anxiety." His observations were uncomfortably accurate, as if he could read her emotional state through her music. The warning signs were subtle at first. He began mentioning specific details about her performances that weren't shown in her videos. The color of the walls behind her, conversations she had with audience members, what she wore when setting up before events. When questioned, he always had plausible explanations, but something felt off. The first direct message came after a particularly emotional performance at a local cafe. Rachel had played Schumann's Träumerei, explaining in her post how the piece helped her process difficult emotions. David's message was long, describing in detail how her body language during the performance revealed inner turmoil she hadn't mentioned. His knowledge of her performances became more specific and unsettling. He could describe the exact way she adjusted her shoulder rest, how many times she tuned between pieces, which coffee shop regulars attended her weekend shows. It became clear he had been watching her in person, probably for weeks. Rachel started noticing a man with a notebook at her performances. He always sat in different places, dressed differently each time, but there was something familiar about the way he held himself. When she tried to approach him once, he disappeared into the crowd before she could get close. The first incident at school happened on a Tuesday morning. Rachel arrived to find sheet music scattered across her classroom, floor. Pages from the exact pieces she had performed over the weekend. The school's security cameras showed nothing, and the janitor insisted the room had been locked all night. The notes began appearing inside her violin case. Small pieces of paper with quotes from their Instagram conversations, left in places only someone intimately familiar with string instruments would know to look. Each note referenced something personal, a gesture she made while playing, a comment to a student, a conversation with a parent. Her weekend performances became exercises in terror. She felt eyes on her constantly, knowing he was in the audience, but never sure where. Her playing began to suffer as her hands shook too much to maintain proper technique. The joy of performing was replaced by dread of what message or observation would come next. The students noticed the change in their teacher. The once enthusiastic Ms. Martinez became jumpy, constantly glancing at the classroom door. She stopped playing demonstration pieces, relying instead on recordings. Parents began to complain about her distracted teaching style, her obvious anxiety, affecting the children. During one weekend performance, every piece she played was requested by anonymous notes left with the cafe staff. Each request came with a detail about when and where she had previously performed that piece. The final request was for Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto, the piece that had started it all. That night, she found her apartment door unlocked. Nothing was taken, but her violin had been carefully removed from its case and left on her bed. Next to it lay a single rose and a note. "Your technique is still flawless, but now I can hear the fear in every note." Rachel's world began to shrink. She stopped performing on weekends, then began canceling private lessons. Her Instagram went dark, but David's presence only grew stronger. He created multiple accounts to comment on her older posts, each message demonstrating an intimate knowledge of her daily life. The school principal called her in for a meeting. Parents had reported receiving anonymous emails about her, claiming she was emotionally unstable and unfit to teach. The emails included details about her private life that only someone watching her closely would know. Her professional reputation was being systematically destroyed. Her violin, her constant companion since childhood, became a source of terror. Every time she picked it up, she imagined him listening, analyzing, judging. The instrument that had once been her voice became a conduit for his control. Even in private, she couldn't play without wondering if he could somehow hear. Other music teachers began receiving messages about her, each containing private details and subtle warnings. Her colleagues grew distant, unsure what to believe. The solidarity of the music department crumbled under the weight of suspicion and fear. Rachel found herself increasingly isolated, exactly as he wanted. The breaking point came during a school concert. Rachel was supposed to accompany her students, but as she raised her violin, she froze. In the audience, she saw multiple men with notebooks, each one potentially him. The panic attack that followed happened in front of the entire school community. Her students watched their teacher collapse on stage, her violin clattering to the floor. That night, she received a recording of her panic attack, taken from somewhere in the audience. The message attached read, "Now your fear makes the most beautiful music of all." The psychological toll became unbearable. Rachel couldn't sleep, barely ate, jumped at every sound. The passion that had defined her life became a weapon used against her. Every aspect of music, teaching, performing, even listening, became tainted by fear. She took a leave of absence from teaching, but the stalking intensified. David seemed to take her withdrawal as a challenge. Messages arrived at her parents' house, where she had fled. Recordings of her playing from years ago appeared on anonymous accounts, each posted with detailed analysis of her emotional state at the time. Her violin sat untouched in its case for weeks. The silence in her life was deafening, but even that wasn't safe. He sent messages describing the specific ways she moved around her parents' house, proving he could still watch her even there. Her world had become a prison of constant surveillance. The police investigation stalled repeatedly. The digital trail was too well concealed, the physical evidence too circumstantial. Each time they thought they had a lead, it evaporated. David seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere, like a melody that stays just at the edge of memory. Other music teachers in the area started reporting similar experiences. Detailed criticism of their technique, unsettling observations about their emotional state, evidence of being watched. The pattern suggested he had moved on to new targets, using Rachel's story to terrorize others in the music community. Her replacement at school received an anonymous package containing recordings of Rachel practicing at home, with timestamps proving they were taken through her windows over many months. The message was clear. He could do the same to anyone who took her place. The revelation of David's identity came not through police work or private investigation, but through a simple mistake in his musical knowledge. In one of his messages, he misidentified a basic concept that any real music professor would know. Rachel's colleague at the school recognized the same mistake from a parent, a former amateur violinist who attended every school concert and performance event. The evidence on his computer revealed years of obsession with female musicians. Rachel wasn't his first target, but she was the one he had studied most intensively. He had hundreds of recordings of her playing, detailed notes about her technique and emotional state, and plans to isolate her from her support system through carefully crafted messages and manipulated recordings. The legal process brought a restraining order and criminal charges, but the damage was profound and lasting. Rachel couldn't return to teaching. The trauma had stolen not just her sense of safety, but her ability to share her passion for music with others. The thought of being observed, analyzed, and judged while playing became unbearable. "I used to think music was the purest form of expression," she wrote in her final email. "Now I can't play a single note without wondering who might be listening, what they might be analyzing, how they might use it against me. He didn't just steal my safety or my career, he stole my voice." The silence in Rachel's life continues. Her violin remains in its case, her Instagram account deleted, her love for teaching buried under layers of trauma and fear. The music that once defined her existence has become a reminder of how completely one person can destroy another's passion. As I write this, Rachel is slowly rebuilding her life away from music. She's training to become a counselor, hoping to help other victims of stalking and psychological abuse. The melodies that once filled her days have been replaced by silence. But in that silence, she's finding a different kind of strength. Sometimes, she tells me, she can still feel the violin's weight in her hands, but the music stays trapped inside, too frightened to emerge. Editor's note: names and identifying details have been changed to protect privacy. This story is part of our ongoing series on stalking awareness and the psychological impact of targeted harassment. My name is Brian Mitchell, and I've covered many stories of online stalking, but this one changed how I see photography forever. The email from Olivia Torres arrived with dozens of wedding photos attached. Beautiful moments turned sinister by what they revealed in their backgrounds. "Every photographer knows about negative space," Olivia's email began. "It's what's not in focus that gives meaning to what is. But what happens when you realize something's been hiding in that negative space all along? Watching, waiting. What happens when you finally see what's been in the background of your own life?" As a freelance wedding photographer, Olivia's Instagram, olivia.captures, was her portfolio. Her feed was a celebration of joy. First kisses, father-daughter dances, tender moments between generations. Her style was distinctly candid, capturing genuine emotions rather than posed perfection. The booking request seemed normal, just another client appreciating her work. Mark Stevens wanted to document his sister's intimate wedding ceremony. His messages were professional, his questions about her experience reasonable. His profile showed a normal guy who frequently commented on wedding photography, apparently planning his sister's perfect day. Their consultation meeting was at a popular coffee shop. Mark brought supposed photos from his sister's previous engagement. Photo shoot, discussing the style he wanted to replicate. He was knowledgeable about photography, asking technical questions about lighting and composition that showed genuine interest. What Olivia didn't notice then was how he positioned himself to see her screen as she showed her portfolio, how his questions mapped out her typical workflow, how he noted every detail about her camera equipment. These realizations would come later, after the horror began. During the wedding, everything seemed normal at first. Olivia did her usual routine, capturing the preparations, the ceremony, the reception. It wasn't until she reviewed the photos, later that night, that she noticed something disturbing. Mark appeared in the background of nearly every shot, always watching her, not the wedding. The messages started coming the next day. Detailed observations about how she worked, which angles she preferred, how she adjusted her camera settings, even what she muttered to herself while concentrating. Things only someone standing very close would know. Her inbox filled with booking requests from different accounts, all eerily similar to Mark's original message. When she declined, they sent photos of her working at recent events. Photos she hadn't taken, showing her from angles that made it clear someone had been following her. At each wedding she photographed, she began finding her equipment slightly moved when she returned to it. Nothing stolen, just shifted enough to show someone had touched it. Memory cards in different slots, lens caps slightly askew. The message was clear. She was never truly alone. The worst part was how he used her own art against her. He began recreating her signature shots at weddings she hadn't photographed, posting them online with subtle accusations about stolen creativity. Other photographers started questioning her originality, damaging her reputation. Finally, she discovered something that made her blood run cold. Going back through her previous wedding shoots, she found Mark's face in photos from months before. She'd met him. He had been studying her, learning her patterns, practicing his approach. The psychological toll became unbearable. Olivia's hands would shake during crucial moments, ruining important shots. She started apologizing to clients for her jumpy behavior, for constantly looking over her shoulder, for flinching at sudden movements. Mark's presence became bolder. He started appearing as a guest at weddings she photographed, always with a plausible explanation. Friend of the family, wedding planner's assistant, venue staff. Each time, he found ways to stay just at the edge of her awareness. Her Instagram followers noticed the change in her work. The joyful, intimate moments she was known for became rare, replaced by safer, more distant shots. Comments appeared asking why her recent photos felt colder, more frightened, less connected. One evening, she returned home to find all her photo frames turned to face the wall. On the back of each frame was a post-it note with a camera setting written on it, the exact settings she had used throughout that day's wedding. He had been in her apartment. The police seemed helpless. Despite the evidence of stalking, Mark was careful to stay just within legal bounds. The photos were taken in public places. The messages could be explained away as professional interest. The coincidental appearances at weddings couldn't be proven as intentional. Every time she looked through her viewfinder, she imagined him on the other side of the lens. The click of the shutter started to sound like a warning, each flash potentially revealing another unwanted presence in her carefully composed shots. The breaking point came during a beach wedding. While photographing the bride getting ready, Olivia noticed something in the mirror's reflection. All the bridesmaids were holding their phones at the same angle, all pointed at her. When she turned around, they were just talking normally. In her test shots, she saw him in the background, standing among the groomsmen. But when she looked up, he wasn't there. Photo after photo showed him in places he couldn't possibly be, closer in each frame, until the final image showed him standing directly behind her. She fled the wedding, leaving thousands of dollars of equipment behind. Her phone flooded with messages from unknown numbers, each one a photo of her running away, taken from different angles. He had somehow orchestrated dozens of people to document her breakdown. That night, checking her cameras at home, she made a horrifying discovery. The metadata on recent photos showed they had been taken with her backup equipment, gear she thought was safely locked away. He had been entering her apartment regularly, using her own cameras to stalk her. The final revelation came when she examined her mirrors closely. They had been replaced with one-way glass. He had been watching her through the walls, photographing her most private moments with her own equipment. Her sanctuary had been his dark room all along. She couldn't even call the police without wondering if he was watching her do it, documenting her moment of weakness through the very walls of her home. The police investigation revealed the horrifying truth. Mark Stevens didn't exist. The wedding where she'd met him had been entirely staged, with hired actors and a rented venue. He had spent thousands of dollars just to get close to her, to learn her patterns. Going through her previous bookings, they found 5 other weddings that had been elaborately staged, each one getting closer to her usual shooting position, each one allowing him to learn more about how she worked. The level of planning was terrifying. Other photographers came forward with similar stories. They discovered their photos contained the same figure in the background, watching, learning, planning. A pattern emerged of systematic stalking of female photographers across multiple states. His real identity was finally revealed. Thomas Reeves, a former photography professor who had lost his job after students reported stalking behavior. His apartment contained walls covered in photos of female photographers at work. Olivia was just his most recent and elaborate target. The planning materials they found showed years of preparation. He had studied her style through her social media, learned her habits, even practiced matching her editing techniques so he could recreate her signature style when infiltrating her professional network. Each new discovery revealed another layer of violation. He had created detailed dossiers on her family, friends, and clients. He knew her schedule, her habits, her fears. He had turned her entire life into a photo study of vulnerability. Olivia hasn't picked up a camera since that day. The mere sight of a lens triggers panic attacks. Her art, once a source of joy and income, has become a trigger for terror. The thought that every photo she ever took might contain evidence of his stalking has contaminated her entire portfolio. She can't look at wedding photos anymore, even those taken by others. Every image seems to hold potential threats in its background, hidden observers in its negative space. The joy she once captured has been permanently tainted by fear. The thing about photography, she wrote in her final email, is that it's supposed to capture truth. But what happens when you can't trust what's in the frame? When every shot might contain something malevolent just out of focus? He didn't just steal my career or my sense of safety. He stole my ability to see the world through a lens without fear. Thomas Reeves is in prison now, but his impact continues. Olivia works as a photography teacher, helping others create art while unable to practice it herself. The cameras that were once her tools for capturing joy sit in storage, gathering dust. Sometimes, she tells me, she dreams about taking pictures again. But in her dreams, every photo shows him getting closer, frame by frame, until she wakes up screaming. The art that defined her life has become a source of terror. Each potential image a reminder that someone might always be watching through their own viewfinder. In the end, he didn't just stalk her, he stole her way of seeing the world. Every frame became a potential threat, every shadow a possible hiding place, every reflection a window for unwanted observers. He turned her art into a weapon against her soul. Editor's note: names and identifying details have been changed to protect privacy. This story is part of our ongoing series on stalking awareness and workplace safety for creative professionals. My name is Brian Mitchell, and this story still haunts the corridors of Seattle General Hospital. The email from Maya Chen arrived at 3 a.m., written during another sleepless night shift. Her words carried the sterile scent of hospital antiseptic and raw fear. I always wanted to help people, Maya's email began. Ever since I was a child, medicine was my calling. But now, every time I put on my white coat, I feel like I'm wearing a target. Every patient room could hide him. Every shadow in the corridor might be watching. The hospital isn't a place of healing anymore. It's become my prison. Maya was in her final year of medical school, doing clinical rotations at Seattle General. Her Instagram account, a future doc Maya, documented her journey through med school, late-night study sessions, coffee-fueled rounds, brief moments of triumph when she mastered a new procedure. Normal posts from a normal student pursuing her dreams. The Kyo first message appeared on a post about successfully completing her first solo patient assessment. Beautiful technique with the stethoscope placement. Your hands are so steady. I bet you can hear my heart racing from here. The account, a grateful patient, seemed innocent enough at first, just someone appreciating medical care. The comments continued, becoming more specific about her techniques, her mannerisms, her daily routines. He noticed things only someone watching very closely would see. How she adjusted her stethoscope before each exam, the way she tucked her hair behind her left ear when concentrating, her preferred routes through the hospital corridors. What Maya didn't realize then was that each interaction was building a detailed map of her vulnerabilities, her schedule, her habits, her moments of exhaustion during long shifts. The hospital's maze of corridors and restricted areas would become a labyrinth of terror. It started with a routine admission, an older man with chest pain, nothing unusual for an emergency department rotation. David Morris was polite, cooperative, and seemed genuinely interested in medical education. He asked Maya thoughtful questions about her studies and career goals. During his 3-day stay, Maya saw him multiple times during rounds. Each interaction was professional, though she noticed he was unusually attentive to medical procedures. He asked detailed questions about hospital protocols, shift changes, and security measures, always under the guise of being a curious patient. After his discharge, Maya began noticing similarities between his questions and recent comments on her Instagram. This grateful patient seemed to know details about hospital procedures that only someone with inside knowledge would understand. The writing style was eerily familiar. The connections started becoming clearer. David had been admitted to multiple departments over the past year, each time when she was rotating through them. His medical complaints were always just serious enough to warrant admission, but tests never showed anything significant. Security footage revealed something more disturbing. During his stays, David would leave his room for hours at night, wandering the hospital corridors. Each time, his path seemed to intersect with Maya's rotation schedule. He had been learning her patterns, studying her movements. One night, reviewing her patient notes, Maya discovered something that made her blood freeze. David's previous admissions all corresponded with her rotation schedule, information that wasn't public. He had been orchestrating his illnesses to follow her through each department. The hospital began feeling like a trap. Every corridor held potential hiding spots. Every on-call room could harbor an intruder. Maya started noticing signs that someone had been in rooms before her. Chairs slightly moved, equipment arranged in ways that mimicked her preferred setup. David began appearing as a patient in different departments, always with new complaints, always during her shifts. Each time, he used a different name, but his pattern remained the same: watching, learning, getting closer. The hospital's size worked against her. There were too many places to hide. Other students started receiving messages about Maya, suggesting she was unstable, making mistakes with patients. Anonymous reports appeared questioning her competency. Her colleagues began watching her more closely, creating an atmosphere of constant surveillance. The isolation grew worse. Walking to her car after night shifts became an exercise in terror. She would find notes on her windshield detailing her actions during the shift, which patients she'd seen, what procedures she'd performed, even conversations she'd had in supposedly private areas. During one overnight shift, Maya discovered all the supplies in her favorite exam room had been rearranged to perfectly match her preferred setup, something only someone who had studied her work habits would know. The message was clear. He knew her routines better than she did. Her own medical knowledge became a source of fear. Every symptom patients reported made her wonder if David was faking them to get close to her. Every admission could be another of his disguises. The skills she'd worked so hard to develop were being turned against her. The breaking point came during a night shift in the pediatric ward. Maya was checking on a young patient when she noticed something wrong with the monitors. They showed recordings from her previous rounds, playing on a loop. Someone had hacked the system to hide the real readings. In a panicked check of other rooms, she found more manipulated equipment, IV pumps programmed to her typical settings, patient charts filled out in imitation of her handwriting, monitors displaying false data. The entire ward had become a stage set designed to disorient her. Racing to alert security, Maya found herself trapped in a stairwell. All her access cards had been deactivated. Security cameras later showed no evidence of tampering, but she knew what she'd seen. The hospital's systems had been turned against her, making her doubt her own sanity. That night, every patient she encountered seemed to use the same phrases David had used, ask the same questions he had asked. It was impossible. They couldn't all be him, but the identical patterns were undeniable. He had found a way to make every interaction feel threatening. When she finally made it to the security office, they found hundreds of photos on their cameras. All of Maya, all taken within the hospital, all focusing on moments when she was alone or vulnerable. The timestamps showed someone had been systematically documenting her movements for months. Her locker contained a worse discovery, a detailed journal written in her own handwriting, but not by her. It contained observations about her daily routines, her habits, her moments of vulnerability. He had been practicing forging her writing, learning to think like her. The investigation revealed the horrifying scope of David's obsession. He had been admitted to 17 different hospitals in the past year, always following medical students. Maya wasn't his first target, but she was the one he had studied most thoroughly. His apartment contained detailed maps of hospital layouts, security patrol schedules, and maintenance access points. He had spent months learning every corner of the hospital, creating a network of hiding places and observation points. The complexity of his planning was terrifying. The most disturbing discovery was how he obtained hospital access. He had stolen ID cards from maintenance workers, made copies of keys, and even acquired old medical equipment to blend in. His knowledge of hospital protocols helped him move freely through restricted areas. Maya's own medical textbooks were found in his apartment, filled with his notes about her study habits. He had been learning medicine alongside her, using her Instagram posts about exams and rotations to track her progress and mirror her knowledge. The final violation was discovered in Maya's apartment. He had installed tiny cameras in her study area, watching her prepare for rounds, learning her thought processes. Her sanctuary had become his classroom, and she never knew. Every corner of her life had been invaded. Her profession, her education, her home. The very knowledge she had worked so hard to obtain had been twisted into a weapon against her. Maya couldn't continue her medical education. The hospital corridors that once represented her dreams now triggered panic attacks. The sound of a stethoscope, the smell of antiseptic, the sight of a white coat, all became triggers for overwhelming fear. "Medicine requires trust," she wrote in her final email. "We ask patients to let us into their most vulnerable moments. But how can I do that when I see a potential threat in every room? When every patient might be him in disguise? When the very tools of healing have become weapons of terror? The investigation revealed David's true identity. James Thorne, a former hospital administrator who had been fired for stalking medical residents. He had spent years perfecting his technique, learning how to manipulate hospital systems and protocols to isolate his targets. Maya now works in medical research, away from patient care. The dream of becoming a doctor lies buried under layers of trauma and fear. The hospital's endless corridors still haunt her dreams, each one hiding potential threats in their shadows. Sometimes, she tells me, she still wakes up reaching for her stethoscope, ready to help someone in need. But then the fear returns, and she remembers how her calling to heal was twisted into an instrument of torture. Her white coat hangs in a closet, untouched, a symbol of dreams destroyed by someone who turned her compassion into a weapon against her. The worst part, she says, isn't the loss of her dream. It's knowing that somewhere out there, in another hospital corridor, another student is probably being watched right now, unaware that their dedication to helping others has made them a target. Editor's note: names and locations have been changed to protect privacy. This story is part of our ongoing series on workplace safety in medical environments and the vulnerability of medical students. My name is Brian Mitchell, and what I'm about to share will change how you see your local gym forever. The email from Lucy Bennett arrived after midnight, when most fitness centers have long closed their doors. Her story reveals how a place meant for self-improvement became a prison of fear. I used to love the sound of weights clinking early in the morning, Lucy's email began. The quiet of an empty gym, the potential of another day helping people transform themselves. Now every clink makes me flinch, wondering if he's watching from between the machines. Every mirror reflects potential threats. Every dark corner could hide him. As a personal trainer at Elite Fitness, Lucy had built a solid following on Instagram, Lucy B Fitness. Her feed showed proper exercise forms, workout tips, and transformation stories of successful clients. Her approach was professional, focused on health and proper technique rather than just aesthetics. The request seemed standard. A new client, James, wanted early morning sessions to fit his busy schedule. His profile showed someone dedicated to fitness, with thoughtful comments on proper form and technique. He seemed knowledgeable and respectful, asking detailed questions about training methodology. Their initial consultation was thorough. James demonstrated good form, asked intelligent questions, and showed genuine interest in doing things properly. He mentioned following her Instagram for months, appreciating her focus on correct technique and sustainable progress. Looking back, Lucy now sees the warning signs she missed. How he positioned himself to always be visible in the mirrors. How his questions mapped her schedule. How he noticed every detail about her training style. The realization would come too late. The first few sessions were normal enough. James worked hard, followed instructions, and maintained professional boundaries. But subtle changes began creeping in. He started arriving earlier, staying later, watching her sessions with other clients from the cardio machines. Lucy began noticing him at the gym during her other clients' time slots. He always had a plausible excuse, changing his workout schedule, doing cardio between meetings. But his presence became constant, his eyes following her movements in the mirrors. The comments on her Instagram grew more specific, analyzing details of her form and technique that only someone watching very closely would notice. He could describe minute adjustments she made while training clients, conversations she had between sets, even which water bottle she used each day. During sessions, he began requiring more physical adjustments, intentionally using incorrect form, so she would need to demonstrate proper positioning. His questions became more personal, probing her schedule, routines, and life outside the gym. The other trainers started receiving messages about Lucy, questioning her certification and expertise. Anonymous reviews appeared online, filled with details about her training style that only a client would know, twisted to sound unprofessional. Then Lucy discovered something chilling. Reviewing security footage for a different reason, she spotted James in the background of her training sessions from months before he became her client. He had been studying her routine, learning her patterns, planning his approach. The stalking escalated in subtle ways. Equipment would be moved slightly before her sessions, arranged in ways that forced her to bend and stretch while he watched. Her usual training spots would be wet with spilled water, requiring her to change locations to less visible areas. James began appearing in her other exercise classes, always positioning himself where he could watch her in the mirrors. Even when she wasn't training him, he found ways to be nearby, pretending to work out while observing her every move. The gym's locker room no longer felt safe. She would find her locker slightly open, nothing taken but clearly searched. Her protein shaker would contain traces of powder she hadn't added, small signs that someone had touched her belongings while she trained clients. Other clients began canceling sessions, citing uncomfortable encounters where James had approached them to ask detailed questions about their training with Lucy. Her client base shrank as he systematically isolated her, using his knowledge of the fitness industry to undermine her reputation. Lucy's own workouts became impossible. Every exercise required turning her back to open spaces. Every stretch made her feel exposed. The necessary outfit for training, tight-fitting workout clothes, began to feel like vulnerability rather than professional attire. One morning, she arrived to find all the mirrors in her usual training area covered in fingerprints at her eye level. Security cameras showed James spending hours after closing time, methodically touching every surface she might use, marking his territory. The breaking point came during an early morning session. Lucy arrived at 5 a.m. to find the gym's lighting system malfunctioning, leaving entire sections in shadow. James had scheduled a session, but something felt wrong from the moment she entered the dark building. Equipment had been arranged into a circuit, all her preferred machines set to her exact specifications with her typical training markers. Someone had studied her patterns so thoroughly they could recreate her entire workout routine. In the locker room, she found her spare training clothes arranged on a bench, clothes she kept locked in her locker. Next to them lay printed copies of her recent Instagram posts, each annotated with detailed observations about her form, her body, her movements. Rushing to alert management, Lucy discovered her access card had been deactivated. Security footage later revealed tampering with the system. But in that moment, she was trapped in the dark gym, knowing James could be watching from any shadow. The emergency exit alarm sounded when she tried to leave, but no help came. Instead, her own voice echoed through the gym's speaker system. Recordings of her training cues and instructions played on a loop. He had been recording her sessions, capturing every word. When help finally arrived, they found every mirror in the gym covered with photos. All of Lucy training clients, all taken without her knowledge, all focusing on moments when she had to make physical contact for form corrections. Her professional necessity had been twisted into something sinister. The investigation revealed the horrifying extent of James's obsession. He had joined multiple gyms where Lucy had previously worked, following her career for years. Each time, he gathered information, studied her methods, and documented her routines before making contact. His apartment contained detailed charts of her schedule, notes on her training methodology, and hundreds of photos taken through gym windows. He had spent months learning her patterns, calculating when she would be most vulnerable. The most disturbing discovery was his home gym, an exact replica of her training area at Elite Fitness, with equipment positioned precisely as she arranged it. He had been practicing her movements, learning to mirror her technique, preparing to insert himself into her life. Lucy's own workout videos had been analyzed frame by frame, with notes on every movement, every cue, every habit. He had studied her so thoroughly he could predict how she would respond in any training situation. The violation extended beyond the gym. He had tracked her to the smoothie shop she visited after training, the grocery store where she bought her meal prep supplies, even the park where she sometimes trained clients outdoors. No part of her routine had remained private. Her professional identity had been completely invaded. Every aspect of fitness, every technique she had mastered, every client relationship had been tainted by his obsession. Lucy couldn't return to personal training. The thought of physical contact with clients, once natural and professional, now triggered panic attacks. The gym environment, the mirrors, the isolated corners, the necessary trust between trainer and client, became impossible to navigate. "Fitness was my way of empowering people," she wrote in her final email. "But how can I empower others when I feel powerless? How can I teach proper form when every correction might be an excuse for unwanted contact? How can I inspire confidence when I'm constantly afraid?" James was eventually identified as Michael Drew, a former fitness instructor who had lost his certification due to stalking allegations. He had spent years perfecting his technique, using his knowledge of gym environments and fitness culture to manipulate his targets. Today, Lucy works as an online fitness coach, removed from physical, client contact. The passion that drove her to help others transform their lives has been twisted into a source of trauma. The gym, once her sanctuary, becomes a place of terror in her recurring nightmare. Sometimes, she tells me, she catches herself planning workout routines imagining coaching clients again. But then she remembers how her expertise was used against her, how her dedication to helping others made her vulnerable to someone who turned every aspect of fitness into a weapon. The sound of weights clinking no longer represents potential and progress. It triggers memories of how thoroughly one person can take something meaningful and transform it into an instrument of terror. Her story reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who learn to weaponize our passions against us. Editor's note: names and identifying details have been changed to protect privacy. This story is part of our ongoing series on workplace safety in the fitness industry and the vulnerability of personal trainers.